Okay, thanks. So yeah, my name's Kevin Kopchynski. I am a part-timer for Audubon. I've been around out at Laughing Brook over in Hamden I've been a seasonal part-time temporary employee for about 40 years out there. I started out working summer camps out there at Laughing Brook. And I've just kind of been around and in the area ever since, doing programs out there, sometimes teaching photography, things like that. So really glad to share some information and some things about Beaver today. Beaver were out there at Laughing Brook for a while, on and off. So, I've definitely had a nice experience of them. I do want to make sure that we notice that the main part of this presentation, the pictures were put together by Scott and Skip there, who work for Audubon, and so they said, Kevin, we need to do a program at Monson. We'll give you a slideshow. So so good. That's good because I didn't have to make up my own, which is really good. I'll try to share a lot of my own experiences and so on. Okay, so let's see what we're going to do here. Just a little basically overview. Beaver, how do beaver fit in the general scheme of living things? A little bit about the history, what beaver have gone through in the area over a few hundred years, and then we'll dive more into their habits and so on, and then we'll get into a little bit of interactions with people and how to manage them sometimes. And we'll end up, I've got a small slideshow, about maybe 7 minutes with some pictures and video. Okay, so all right, I keep pressing the wrong darn button. I do apologize for that. Okay, so we'll get into some taxonomy, classification, right? So how do beaver fit in with the rest of living things? That's the general idea of taxonomy. Taxonomy is looking at living creatures and figuring out who's related to who and things like that, trying to put together a picture of living things. So in taxonomy, you've got this classification system, and mnemonic devices are ways to remember things, and you might remember this from school or something like it in biology for animal classification, right? So this one, King Philip crossed over for great spaghetti. I think I had green spaghetti. Anybody else remember anything different from their school days? But basically the idea is that each of the first letters helps us to remember the different categories of living things. So you have a species, which is one kind of creature. Similar species are grouped together into a genus, then similar of those into family, and so on, and we work up until we have kingdom. If we look at what we have for beaver, they are in the animal kingdom. The phylum, the big divisions of the kingdom, they are in the chordates, and then they are mammals. The class is mammals. They are rodents, the order Rodentia, and the family Castoridae. And then the beaver is known scientifically as Castor canadensis. Right, that is its scientific name. If you use that name with any biologist, they know exactly what you're talking about, what animal you're talking about. That's another goal of taxonomy, because you have different common names for things, and they're different. So, for example, I think out in the Rockies there is a mountain beaver. It's really more of a muskrat than a beaver, so not as closely related. Actually, in that family, there's only two beaver living today. In that family, we have our North American beaver, and then there's a Eurasian beaver, and those are the only two members of that whole family, Castoridae, and the genus Castor. And remember that Castor and Castoridae, we're going to remember that we're going to come across that word a little bit later. So there have been other beaver in the past, other members of that family in the past. In North America, in the past, there was actually one that was as big as a bear. And although they say it still only had the brain the size of our beaver today. So anyway, so we think about, there's an example of a skull up there, and there's some other to look at later if you'd like. The skull tells us a lot about how an animal lives and what it does, its different adaptations that it has. And a couple of things to note, of course, the big front teeth, we'll get into the teeth a little bit more. But on the right-hand side, on the right, those big sort of bulbs, right, on the edge, on the sides of the head, that encases the inner ear. And the size of that is one indication that this is an animal that probably has really good hearing, and they do. So even when, for example, when you find if you find fossils of these other beaver that used to live, you might be able to tell something about them. From that, you also have a kind of a longish snout area that it can hold a lot of receptors for scent. So they have pretty good scent as well. But then, of course, probably the main thing as you look at that are the teeth, right? Mammals in general have 4 types of teeth. They have the incisors, right? Those big front teeth on the beaver. In general, other mammals have more than just the 2, or actually 4, 2 up or 2 lower. They have more than just the 2 pair, but for beaver, it is just the 2. Behind incisors are usually canine teeth, which are more for tearing, and from that name, as you might imagine, those are teeth maybe that more carnivores have, and you notice there's kind of a big empty space there behind the incisors. So these are herbivores. These particular ones, they don't have canine teeth. And then they've got premolars and molars, grinding teeth, because their food is plant food. You have to grind it up really, really, really well. So again, just by looking at teeth and what teeth are there, what teeth aren't there, you can start to think and learn a lot about the animal that way. Looking at from the side here, looking at the skull from the side, you see how the front teeth come together. Now that yellow color is a special sort of enamel that is common to many rodents. It gives sort of an extra hard coating to the tooth, to the outer side of the tooth anyway. The inner part of the tooth is more regular sort of tooth that's a little softer. And you kind of see how they grind together there, and it actually sharpens the tooth into a very chisel-like point, which is great for chewing through those trees. So, again, just from looking at things like that, you can tell things about how they live. Of course, with living beavers, we can go out and watch them too. All right, so let's get a little bit into their history, the history of beaver in not just New England, really, but North America, and really the history of after Europeans came over. Okay, why, if it's hard to see, that's a bunch of hats there. Okay, why is there a bunch of hats there? They're made out of beaver fur. So beaver fur got to be a very popular thing. We'll talk more about the qualities of the fur in a little while, but a very, very luxurious fur and became very popular. So a lot of people wanted those beaver hats over in Europe. There's a trapper with one of his prizes, and again, a bunch of people wearing those hats. It was tough on other animals too, feathers for the birds, other kinds of fur animals. But even by the mid-1600s in this country, there were 80,000 beaver pelts leaving New England, going out to England and Holland. By the late 1700s, we started making the hats here. And so you had hat factories opening up. And then one thing that in the process of making the hat and kind of smoothing down the fur, they brushed it with turns out, very toxic compound called mercury nitrate. Mercury is an incredibly dangerous neurotoxin. And it causes muscular problems. It causes problems with speech, problems with thinking. So many of these people develop these problems, and this may have led to the idea that's the saying, being mad as a hatter, because it was an occupational hazard for sure. People also ate beaver meat. Beaver meat's a little richer in fat and actually is a better wild meat than some of the others. And the other thing is that beaver have some scales on their tail. And in the Christian churches and people who came over here, predominantly Christian churches, they had the fast day. You weren't allowed to eat meat. Well, the Pope had declared that beaver were fish because they had scales on their tail. And so you could still eat beaver on the days that you couldn't eat other meats. So that didn't help the beaver very much at all. So there was a lot of hunting and trapping pressure on them. Just an idea to how valuable. And again, there's a beaver skin up there that you can take a look at later. This is what one beaver skin you could trade for other animals, okay? And, maybe an otter, a beaver, they're about the same size, but you could get one bear skin for a beaver skin. Bear's pretty big. That's a lot more skin than the beaver, right? Or even 4 large seals or half a moose, right? So they were valuable. These were very highly prized furs. And even, you think of luxurious furs, maybe you think of mink, right? You can get 8 mink for a beaver. Of course, mink are pretty small, though. And if you weren't trading for fur, you could trade for other stuff. And again, this is what you could trade for a beaver pelt and get some cloth, food, gunpowder, tools. And, we take things like hoes and axes and knives maybe for granted right now, but, the metal to make those was not necessarily common back then, way back then. And just to give an idea of how many beaver were being hunted here in a period of about 5 years, about 9,000 beaver. And we're talking about the mid-1600s. Okay, about 9,000 beaver were shipped from the Connecticut River Valley area. Now, the Connecticut River drainage is pretty big. All right, so that it does encompass a lot of territory, but still, that's a lot of beaver being hunted, well over 1,000 a year, almost 2,000 a year from this area, from Springfield. Looking at their range. Now, in order to understand this map, first take a look at Texas, and see that pinkish color that Texas is. That's the color of their range. So anything that's that color on the map, that's where they are, which is pretty much most of North America. In Massachusetts, they're found everywhere except on the Cape and Martha's Vineyard and Nantucket. They're not found in those places. But otherwise, they're all over Massachusetts now. They didn't used to, for a while that wasn't true, but they're back as we'll see. Beaver are a regulated animal. They're a fur-bearing animal, so there are regulations about how and when you can take beaver fur, and if you break the rules, it gets confiscated. So beaver were taken out, and by somewhere by the late 1700s, there were no beaver left in Massachusetts. And so we say they were extirpated from Massachusetts. They weren't extinct, they were beaver other places, but they were extirpated from Massachusetts and a lot of New England. But also about that time, seal cats took over from beaver hats. And silk hats became the thing, and silk was easier and cheaper to get than beaver. So the demand for beaver fur really dropped off somewhere in the late 1700s and into the 1800s as well. And so by the late 1800s, people were starting to think about getting beaver back to where they used to be. The woman in this picture, her name's Dorothy Richards. She was out in the Adirondacks of New York. And so she started this movement. And in the early 1900s, beaver were trapped from Canada and from out west and brought into the Adirondack area. Started out with about 30 of them in the early 1900s, like 1901, 1907. By the 1915, there were 15,000 of them. And by the 1920s, the authorities in New York deemed that the population was stable enough that you could trap some. So, so they opened up trapping again on them. And somewhere around then, a few of those beavers, upstate New York's not that far from Massachusetts, few of them made it over into Massachusetts. And so there was about a 150-year period where there were no beaver in Massachusetts, but that ended in the early 1900s. And just to help a little bit more, a few more beaver were brought into the area, to the Mass Audubon Sanctuary out in Lenox, the Pleasant Valley. They brought another handful out there. And it's been pretty good for them ever since. Again, they're stable enough that they can be regulated, having a regulated season of trapping. And also there's controls about how humane the trapping is. So now, all right, let's think more about them. And again, thinking about, right, they are highly, highly adapted to living where they do. They are aquatic animals. They can hold their breath for 15 minutes. They have valves over their nose and ears to shut out the water. They can bring their lips in behind those big giant teeth and seal off their mouths, but then the teeth can still grab on something and transport it. They have webbed feet, and you've got the tail, right, which is a great rudder for when you're swimming. The tail also helps for other things. The tail kind of acts as a brace or a stand for when they're gnawing down a tree. If you've been around, I understand a few people here have a lot of beaver around, right? So a lot of you probably heard the tail slapping, right? When it gets upset, right? And so the tail slapping is either an alarm call or intimidation. They might be just trying to intimidate whatever they perceive is out there as a threat or as maybe a potential rival. They get to be anywhere from 30 to 80 pounds as an adult, maybe about 3.5 feet long or so. So, again, very well adapted, very well suited to living out there. Now let's talk about their fur a little bit. They have outer fur, it's kind of called the guard fur, and that outer fur they can slick down with some oils to help keep it waterproof, and then underneath they have the under fur, which is sometimes referred to as wool. That underfur is very, very dense. In other words, there's a lot of it packed together. So you can have a little, just a postage stamp size piece of that fur, of that underfur, that has more hair on it than the typical human head. So it's just very dense and luxurious, and that was their undoing. Again, there is a sample fur over there that you can take a look at. They can look at later, and then they have an oil gland that can secrete oil that they use to waterproof themselves, and that is called the castor gland. Okay, right? Remember Castoridae, Castor canadensis, right? So that's they have the castor gland, and they use that to groom, and they use that for something else that we'll see in just a bit. Now, they're not the only aquatic mammal out there. One of those is not a beaver, okay? And I think maybe you can tell from the picture, okay? The one on the left is a muskrat. And if you can see the tail, it's a skinny tail. They don't have that big, broad, fat tail like the beaver does. The other thing is they only get to be 2 to 3 pounds, not 30 to 80, right? They're a much smaller animal, but they are, they are also highly aquatic. So you might see them in the same area. I guess another thing you can see is the otter. It's kind of hard to confuse the two of those if you get a good look at them. All right, so let's think about how they eat, right? Here's a beaver carrying this branch back to its lodge. That branch maybe doesn't look like very yummy food to you or me, right? But this is one of their main staples of food, especially over the winter months when there's not a lot of green vegetation around. They are going to eat bark. They're going to eat leaves, twigs, and bark. And just under the outer layer of that bark is very, very nutritious, at least for what it is, for wood. It's very nutritious. So they do eat that. Now they do eat a lot of leafy plants. They really like lilies. They do eat a lot of water lilies, for example. I have an example of a book over there. It's called Lily Pond, and it is actually written by a woman who, in the Adirondacks, spent about 4 years observing beaver in a somewhat remote pond, and she noted how much they eat water lilies up there. So one thing, though, feeding on on twigs and bark, and not bark so much, but the wood, just that top layer of wood, it's not an easy thing to digest. They have bacteria to help them out in their guts, but even then, it's not very efficient. And so when it leaves the other end, there's still a lot of nutrition in there. Beaver don't let things go to waste, and this is actually true of many herbivores. So we say that beaver and some other herbivores are called cecotrophes. And that means that they eat their own poop. And they redigest it and get more of that nutrient out of it. So you think of beaver, they're really, really good recyclers. Okay, they really take recycling to an extreme. But anyway, that's, now they're so handy, some of their handiwork there. They can take, they can cut down a tree, a 5-inch tree. I don't know what maybe like that, right? So a tree that's like 5 inches wide, they can take that out in a few minutes. And so they are downing the tree for a few reasons, mostly for food and building material. So they'll take the small branches and take them back to build a lodge or to build a dam, and also for at least for the trees that they like, to actually eat the bark. You can see on this that there's been some bark kind of nibbled off, and you can also, there's one of the pieces of wood over there where all the outer bark has been nibbled off, and just under that bark is the green section that has all of the nutrients in it. They don't eat the inner wood. The inner wood is just dead, so they don't really eat that. But they also, excuse.
What's the rationale then? So if you're only interested in the outer layer,
yeah,
why are you making this cone shape? You're clearly, there's no reason.
Oh, the cone shape, I think, is just to get the tree down. So, they narrow it down until it's very skinny and it pops over. They're not really eating that. They're just getting rid of that so they can get through the tree and bring it down. I think that's it, if I understand the question right. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Okay. And I think it's generally a pretty good rule in nature in general that if any creature is doing something, they're not wasting their time, because they can't. Right, whatever they are, they can't go to the grocery store to get food. You know, they are out there getting food, making their shelters or whatever. So, yeah. The other thing they can do, and I've seen this out at Laughing Brook when there were beaver around, there's some trees that they don't really like to eat. They really don't like white pine, they don't like hemlock to eat it. But if there's a hemlock, for example, growing, a nice large hemlock that's growing and shading an area, and shading out the other goodies that might grow there, they girdle the trees. And in that case, they just take out the bark, and just enough to kill the tree. And unfortunately, that trail got washed away in the flood over at Laughing Brook, but along one of the trails, you used to be able to see a girdled hemlock tree that they wanted, you know, so they adjust their areas quite a bit, as we'll actually, as we even, here's an example next, the canals. You know, you think of dams, you think of the lodges, right? They can make canals depending on where they are. And they're aquatic animals. They want to be in the water. They're safe in the water. So they move much more easily through the water than they do on land. So where it's feasible, they can dig canals from one area to another, and then when they flood the area with the dam, the canal fills with water, and they can get around. A lot of that depends on what area they're in, and if there's enough area to expand into to do that. I know over at Laughing Brook, the potential area for them is very small. They wouldn't really need a canal over there. I think we've got a little sample of somebody eating. I think it's got a water lily there, actually. Nice water lily roll. And a little later on, as I said, I'll have some other pictures and videos that we can see. And by the way, you know, thanks for asking the question, because I forgot to mention, if you do have a question, please just wave and say something as we go along. We'd be glad to answer any questions as we go along. Okay, come on, give me my next one. There we go. So let's see, we're just going to get into now some of their habits and so on. Beaver family. So basically, when you see a beaver pond, it is a family. There is the two adults who initially moved into that area, built the first dam, built the first lodge, and started to have kids. They have somewhere around April or so, the female gives birth. The litter can be anywhere from 4 to 8 kits. They are weaned after about 3 months, so where that puts them out there in the middle of the summer sometime, right, where they start to learn how to feed for themselves and also to help out. They stay around for 2 years. So what you're seeing, if you go to an individual pond, you're going to be seeing the original pair, the young of that year, and last year's young in general. And so they stay around that extra year. That helps them to learn more about being a beaver. There's a lot to it. And it gives mom and dad a lot of help around the place. Keep that dam maintained, the lodge, and so on. So they hang around, and after 2 years, generally they are kicked out after 2 years, and they have to go find another spot. They can start having babies at around 3 years. And in the wild, they've been known to live around 20 years. They might be more, but that's what we have records of anyway. Now, okay, the dam, right? That's probably what we think of mostly with them, that they can make dams, right? So they live again, they're aquatic, they're safe in water, they prefer to be in water, and unlike many animals, when they come in and they don't see what they need, they make what they need by making a dam on some flowing water and backing it up to create a pond. So they start out with some mud and stone along the bottom. Then they start bringing in branches, and they kind of bring in and they put the stick end of the branch, they put downstream. And so all the little branches and leaves are facing upstream, and that starts to catch debris and start to fill in, and then they fill that in with more sticks and start to fill, when there's a lot of sticks, they can start to fill in the cracks with mud, and eventually they have a dam that holds water. They're always tending to it to make sure that it doesn't leak too much, but that, you know, it holds water. The dam, depending on where they are, it can be up to 100 feet in length. It can be 6 feet high. So they can be pretty massive structures. A beaver is instinctually reacting to the sound and the feel of running water. And they act in a way to stop that water from running. They also make lodges here in not the most convenient of places, but the lodge is basically, it starts out as a big pile of mud, and then they start to hollow it out from the inside. They add more, again, sticks and more mud around the outside. They leave the top without mud, and so there's ventilation up the top. And in the winter, if there's an active lodge with beaver inside breathing out moist air, in the winter you can usually see that steam from the respiration rising from there. When they first move into an area, they might make bank burrows, where they'll just go into the bank of a river or a stream and just go in underneath and start living there at first, until maybe they get the dam, get the pond going, and so on. Here's a better look at the lodge, or sort of a cutaway. The entrance is underwater. Okay, so you see the side there, that he was swimming in from underwater, and it's going to surface in the lodge. The living area, of course, is above water, and they usually have a couple of entrances. And then also you see over on the right, it says food store. So a few pictures back, that beaver we saw swimming with that big stick, it was most likely going to bring it back to the lodge and then go underwater and shove it down into the mud and have it down there. Because if the pond freezes over altogether and really thick ice, they can't get out of the pond in the winter to find food. So they make a storage of these branches underwater right next to the lodge, and all they need to do is pop out the door, grab some, pop back in. All right, so great way to spend the winter, right? So anyway, and you might see, you know, before the ice comes, you might see just the tips of those branches sticking up out of the water near a lodge, you know, if you do see the lodges there. They do have a home range, and as I said, basically the home range is the pond where they're at, and they have a way of telling other beaver that somebody's here. It's called a scent mound. So they make this pile of mud, right? That's what they have available for working with, right? So they make this pile of mud on the side, and then they use that castor, their castor gland, the castoreum, the oil gland, and that also has an odor to it, and they put that all over so that it gives off an odor that tells beaver that somebody's here. You can't have this pond. This pond is taken.
Is that something a human can smell?
Yeah. Yes. Yes. Yes, you can. I was actually going to describe that. One of the books I have out there is a tracking book from a master tracker who I actually studied with, and he had us out and he showed us. It was actually really small, the one that he showed us. And you know, you pick it up and you smell it. At least I did, and I don't have the greatest of sinuses, so this may not be a general experience. But you know, at first I picked it up, I smelled it, and I thought, you know, that just smells like mud, right? But then I just went, you know, a few feet away, I just picked up some random mud, and I smelled that, and I smelled from the scent, and there's a big difference. There's a big difference. You may have to get right onto it to notice. Now, again, beaver are going to have better scent than we do, or better sense of smell than we do, so they pick it up pretty readily. But yeah, if you get up to it and give a good sniff, you would notice it for sure. And again, that's a sign that it is active. The other thing is too that I forget if I mentioned that they mate for life. Okay, when we talked about sort of their family life. So they do mate for life. However, the life of one of them may end abruptly for various reasons. And in that case, the remaining beaver can sort of add some hormones into that mix, and that smell tells a beaver coming by that there's a vacancy. Okay, and for which gender there is the vacancy. So there's and not just beaver, but a lot of animals are really communicating through scent, very, very, very much. And beaver are just no exception to that. So that's a big deal for them. That's a big thing for them. It's not all fun and games out there if you're a beaver. There are predators. However, the main predator still remains to be people. However, you can have coyotes, the small, especially it's going to be mostly the young beaver that are taken, because trying to take a 30 or 80 pound animal is not an easy thing to do, even if you're a coyote. But the small ones could be taken by owls and hawks, so on. Otter are known to prey on beaver, although otter are also known to live side by side with beaver. So that's an interesting one. Bear will take one if they have the opportunity. So they do have predators. But again, humans are still probably the top predator on them. If they, excuse me?
Sorry, we have a lot of fisher and we have a lot of bobcat.
Fisher, yep, definitely.
Bobcat as well?
I don't know about bobcat, so I would have to think a bobcat would take a young. But I don't know, an 80-pound beaver is about a good match for a bobcat, even outweighs it. So that would be tough. And we think of herbivores sometimes as these gentle creatures, but you don't want to mess with those incisors. They'll put up a good fight, and those are pretty tough teeth. If they do get out in the winter and they can get out of the pond, you might find tracks. Again, you'll see that they have webbed feet. Usually the back foot comes right down where the front foot was, so you just see the trail of the back feet. And then very interesting to hear that about the series that's here. So we have this idea of a keystone species that, as I mentioned, beaver, if they don't see what they need, they make it. And so that's a pretty extensive beaver pond, right? And as you can imagine, other animals are taking advantage of that. That it makes a great habitat for a lot of other things. Now, they might find, they don't need to have a beaver pond to live at. They can live in other ponds. But certainly the beaver pond makes a great habitat for a lot of different creatures. And so we refer to beaver as a keystone species, that they create, in what they do, they create the environment, whatever, for lots of other creatures to live, a great diversity of creatures to live. And really coral reef, corals are another keystone species. And you say, wait a minute, they just sit there, right? But they make whole islands. They make whole islands. So the coral reef, that is a structure that was built by those coral. And again, there's all those nooks and crannies. And the amount of diversity around a coral reef is just stupendous. For the small amount of area that they take up on the globe, they have something like 30% of all the biodiversity. But the percentage of area that they take up is minuscule. But beaver are another great example of that. You get to see, again, for the folks who have the beaver around, you get to see lots of other wildlife too, I would imagine, right? Yeah, yeah. All right, so let's think about what happens though when their activities kind of clash with ours, and what you can do about that's especially a Skip Lyle. So one thing you could do is you can, if you have particular trees you really don't want them to get at, you can fence off the trees. Now the 30 to 80 pounds kind of works against them now. They are very clumsy on land. They don't climb really. So, a 4-foot fence is going to be fine to keep them out. And as long as you get that hugging the ground really, really well, they don't really dig when they're out of the water. So they're not going to dig under it. And as long as you've got a little bit of space between the wire and the tree, they can't get at it. And the tree's pretty safe. But there's other impacts that they have. So that road is flooded, and it's flooded because of beaver. Okay, what did they do? Well, when roads cross streams, they're going to have some form of a culvert where it gets the water from one side of the road to the other, under the road safely, so that you can drive over it. But again, that's going to be running water, right? And beaver hear that running water, they feel it, and they start to plug things up. And then you get the roadway, and then the water's going to go somewhere, so it's going to go out over the road. And so that's what you have. So now you've got to try to take some action, and what you can do is you can kind of use that instinct against them. See, beaver deceiver, right? So you're trying to fool them, and again, they're reacting to the running water, sound and feel of running water. So if you can somehow get that water through that culvert without it creating all that running, the sound and so on, the beaver aren't going to respond to it. And that's the sort of concept behind a beaver deceiver. And they take various forms depending on where they're at. So you see, there's the culvert. The culvert on the left, and then on the right, you can see that pipe. And the pipe, the culvert, right, it's right down here. Okay, right. So and the pipe. So you can see that the pipe is running from a bit of a distance away from there. And it's protected by that screening, and it kind of pipes the water through there without that sound and motion that triggers the beaver to make a dam. And so they are deceived, and you've got a culvert that doesn't wash away, at least most of the time. Sometimes it just doesn't work, but most of the time, that's what you do. And you can usually find a way. There is out at Laughing Brook, if you go down to the pond there and look off to the left, you can see the top of a beaver deceiver out there. Where the same thing, the water was from a little bit distance away, the water was piped under. That pond is at Laughing Brook, that pond is actually a man-made pond. So out there to the left is actually a dam, a human dam. Beaver have tried to enhance it over the years. So the water again is piped from a distance under that without creating that running water. Besides roadways, another thing you really need to protect are stone bridges. If that area gets plugged up, where it goes under, if that gets plugged up and the water starts backing up against that bridge, the bridges aren't made for that. They're, the engineering, you think about, that could have been made, in the 1800s, maybe even the 1700s, a long time ago, and has survived all this time. They're engineered really well to be bridges, over, pretty much, you can go over a stream, but they're not made to hold, they're not made to be dams at all. So you don't want that to get plugged up. And so you can see in a couple of pictures here, sort of a huge beaver deceiver that they're making to put in there. You can see, I think, the pipe over there. on the right there. That's so kind of a much larger pipe. And there again, you can see the pipe kind of getting into position. On the right, you can kind of see it getting into that baffle that keeps the beaver away from the mouth of the pipe, and also kind of baffles the water a little bit so it doesn't make quite as much of that sound. And then hopefully you end up with a pretty safe bridge. I mentioned Laughing Brook, where I know, but there's some of the other places, some of the other sanctuaries in the Mass Audubon that you can see some of these different, they call them flow devices, some different beaver deceivers. Basically, the design depends on where you're at and what you're dealing with. There haven't been beaver. I think the other thing about beaver is some of the pictures, some of those magnificent ponds, those have probably been there for a while. But beaver are not necessarily in an area for very long, depending on the quality of the habitat. And in the case of Laughing Brook, there's not really a lot of great food that grows around that pond and in the immediate woods. So they've come and gone over the years from there. There were some, as I mentioned, I've been around there for a while now. And even before I got there, there was some, I can show you some beaver stump that was more than 40 years ago, more than when I was around there. And then I can show you some other more recently, more into the maybe 90s, into the 1990s. Some of them moved in for a while. But again, depending on the lay of the land and what's growing there, they can deplete the good food, and then they have to move on. And that's pretty much what happened at Laughing Brook, except they got maybe a little more motivation to leave after a fire, after the fire out there. And all the, because that's about the last I saw of beaver regularly there. I think in the last few years, I think I've seen one swimming around there once, but it probably was kind of checking things out and didn't find anything to eat and probably moved on. But they, eventually all that stuff that was eaten in the past, that's all going to sprout up again and come back. In a large enough area, they may chow down all the stuff over here. Meanwhile, that stuff all grows back. And then when this stuff is gone, they can go back over there. And by the time they chow that down, this stuff grew back. And they can stay in the area for a while. That's usually a very large, flat area where they can really expand out the pond. Again, at Laughing Brook, if you're familiar at all, right beyond the pond, there's a big old hill. And you're not going to expand any pond much further out than what it already is. So a lot depends on that. And so you may have areas that are abandoned by beaver as well. They don't always stay in the same place. All right, so let's go ahead. I'll end up with, as I mentioned, I've got a little video here with some pictures and a few video that I've gotten over the years, and about 7 minutes. So they're aquatic, you usually just find them swimming. see the tail in that picture. Notice a lot of, you don't really see the tail. That's one of the more, I think that was really highly preferred. But yeah, that's a good point. I mentioned stuff that
There we go, so
that's a big thing.
that's all common.
Yeah. And that probably went before the merge.
Yeah, it's really one area that's all common. But it's not the way we're choosing black.
Okay, yeah. Yeah, I didn't think that.
It's not first, not that's the choice. In general, just like soccer.
So, mostly Hardens. So, yeah, while this guy's munching away here, gal, the question was, what I mentioned food that they don't like, right? But yeah, there are definitely foods that they do prefer, and things like poplar are very, very highly preferred. Around the pond at Laughing was a lot of alder. That they took that out pretty fast, but they're not really crazy about like oak, but they do take it. Maple they do like pretty much, and the black birch. So they do have preferences, and as you can, if you notice what's growing, you can tell. And again, out of that, but there's just not a lot of their preference at all right now. I was kind of hoping they'd start eating autumn olive, but no luck there.
They mind.
I saw one place where they took some autumn olive, and I said, okay, go guys, but good. And unfortunately, most of our autumn olive actually would not be accessible to beavers. Beaver.
Yeah, they get Japanese knot would be a great thing.
Oh yeah, yes, yeah, that would be good. Especially at least early in the season, maybe you could. So yeah, we talk about, if only they would start eating some of the invasive species, that would be great.
Yeah.
Well, that's good news to hear. So autumn olive, they're taking. I think the problem with Laughing Brook is they can't get at the autumn olive, or they couldn't. That's there. Again, they're not going to go more than, I think 200 feet is a long way for them to go out in the water to get something. And where a lot of the autumn olive is at Laughing Brook is kind of up a hill and away from the water. So they probably weren't going to get that. And what caught my eye here was all the water moving around at first. I was like, what is going on there? Why is that water moving around so much? And then I was able to see, this is with a long lens, so the beaver was not as obvious standing there as it is in this image, because this is with a good long lens.
Can the beaver contaminate a pond?
Yeah, there's another, do the beaver contaminate pond? And the answer is that yes. Beaver carry a disease called Giardia, make you really sick, intestinal problem. It's some kind of a bacteria. It may not be a bacteria, it might be a protist of some kind. But anyway, yeah. So you cannot drink water at all. If there's any place, if there's beaver around anywhere, you should not drink the water.
Dogs get it too.
And the dogs can get Giardia? Oh my goodness.
Yeah.
Wow, that's not good.
Upstream would be okay though, right? I mean,
I guess if you know, right, if you're upstream and you know there's nothing upstream, there's no more of them upstream from where you're at, it's possible that would be all right. But that is, I think, one thing as they spread more. I remember going out into the White Mountains and hiking up there when I was younger, and you could drink from the streams up there and everything. But now I'm pretty sure the advices don't do that unless you filter it. It used to be really nice just to scoop out of a stream and take a drink, but if there's beaver around, that's not a good idea. So yeah, they can contaminate in that way, yes. You can buy filters that filter it out. So, you boil, something like that. So it's not like the water's contaminated forever, but you can't just scoop and drink. Definitely not. So folks are welcome to go over there and have a look at the skin, whatever, the skull and everything. Just see, you can handle it, just be very careful, please, with the skull especially. I mentioned the Lily Pond book. I think I mentioned the tracking book. The green book is just called Wild Mammals of New England. It's just a great reference for any mammal in New England, not just